Florence Cathedral, April 26, 1478. The nave was packed. High Mass. The smell of incense hung heavy in the air. Candles trembled in the updraft from 1,000 bodies standing still. Above the congregation, Brunelleschi's dome, the largest in the world, floated in the dark like a second sky. The moment came. The priest raised the host. Every head in that cathedral bowed. The bell rang once. Silence fell like a dropped cloth. And in that silence, the most sacred moment in the Christian Mass, on a Sunday morning, in the most beautiful cathedral in Europe, two men reached beneath their robes. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter a dynasty, destroy a family, and reveal something about the Renaissance that its history books prefer not to say out loud. The Pope knew. To understand what happened in that cathedral, you need to understand what Florence was and who ran it. The Medici family were not kings. They held no title, no crown, no hereditary office. But for 3 generations, they had been the invisible hand behind the city. They bankrolled popes. They financed wars. Their bank had branches in London, Bruges, Lyon, Rome, a financial network that stretched across the known world. And at the head of this empire in the 1470s was a young man named Lorenzo. Lorenzo de Medici was not a handsome man. He had a famously flat nose, a harsh nasal voice, and a face that didn't inspire poetry. But he commanded rooms. He wrote poetry himself. He patronized Botticelli, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. He was, in the eyes of Florence, something between a statesman and a god. His younger brother Giuliano was something else entirely. Physically graceful, popular with the streets, the beloved public face of Medici power. Together, they were Florence. And in Rome, someone had decided they needed to go. The story doesn't begin with a dagger. It begins with a ledger. In 1474, Pope Sixtus IV wanted to purchase the town of Imola, a strategic possession in central Italy, the kind of city that gives you control of roads, trade routes, and military approaches to Florence. He came to the Medici Bank, as popes always did. The Medici Bank said no. Lorenzo de Medici had his reasons. Imola, in papal hands, would tip the balance of central Italian power against Florence. It was a political calculation dressed as a financial decision, correct strategy, terrible consequences. Sixtus IV did not forget. He turned to the Pazzi. The Pazzi were old money, ancient by Florentine standards. Their family name traced back to the First Crusades. According to their own legend, a Pazzi ancestor had brought back flints from the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And those flints still lit the Easter fire in Florence Cathedral every year. They were proud, ambitious, and perpetually outranked by the Medici. They said yes to the Pope. Sixtus rewarded them immediately. The lucrative church banking account, the papal treasury's business, one of the most valuable financial relationships in Europe, was stripped from the Medici and handed to the Pazzi. In a single stroke, the Pazzi had the Pope's patronage, the Pope's money, and the Pope's ear. And the Medici had an enemy they hadn't fully counted on. But there's a limit to what you can do with money. What happened next required something else. In 1476, 3 men began meeting in Rome. Archbishop Francesco Salviati, a Pazzi ally appointed to his see by Sixtus IV. Girolamo Riario, the Pope's own nephew, and Francesco de Pazzi himself, head of the Pazzi Bank's Florentine operations, a man who had watched the Medici outmaneuver his family for years and carried the accumulated resentment of every slight. They weren't meeting to discuss banking. The plan was simple, as plans for murder usually are before reality complicates them. Lorenzo and Giuliano de Medici would be killed. Together, at a moment when their presence was guaranteed. Simultaneously, Florence's seat of government, the Palazzo della Signoria, would be seized. With the Medici gone and Florence's civic apparatus in Pazzi hands, Papal troops already positioned near the city would march in to consolidate the new order. Done. Clean. Florence liberated from the Medici as the conspirators saw it. A new Florence. Pazzi-aligned, papal-friendly, compliant. There was only one problem. They needed someone to do it. They brought in a professional, Giambattista da Montesecco, a condottiere, a mercenary captain, a soldier's soldier, loyal to the Pazzi, experienced in exactly this kind of work. He listened. He agreed in principle. Then came the question of location. The attack, the conspirators decided, would take place during High Mass at the Florence Cathedral, the Duomo, on a Sunday morning, when both Medici brothers would be certain to be present. Montesecco refused. He would not kill inside a church, not on consecrated ground, not during the elevation of the host. He was a soldier, not a heretic. He drew a line. It is one of the most extraordinary details in the history of this conspiracy. The professional killer found a moral limit that the Pope of Rome did not, because the Pope had been consulted directly. When Montesecco asked, sitting in a private audience with Sixtus IV in Rome, whether the Holy Father sanctioned what they were planning, Sixtus responded with a sentence that has echoed through 5 centuries of historical debate. "I do not wish the death of anyone, only a change of government." Everyone in the room understood what that meant. The soldier still wouldn't kill in a church. So the conspirators found replacements. 2 men willing to do what a hardened mercenary refused. 2 priests, Stefano da Bagnone, a tutor in the Pazzi household, Antonio Maffei da Volterra, a man carrying a personal grudge against Lorenzo, whose forces had sacked his hometown 6 years earlier. Men of God would do what the soldier would not. Sunday morning, April 26, 1478. Both Medici brothers were present, as planned. What no one told Giuliano de Medici was that Francesco de Pazzi had escorted him to the church that morning with his arm around Giuliano's shoulder, in something that looked exactly like friendship. He was checking whether Giuliano wore armor beneath his doublet. He didn't. The Mass proceeded. Latin responses. Incense. The slow ritual of a congregation that had done this 1,000 times. Then came the elevation. The priest raised the host. Every head bowed. The bell rang once. Silence. The knives came out. Francesco de Pazzi came at Giuliano from behind, Baroncelli alongside him. What happened next was not an assassination. It was an eruption. Years of accumulated humiliation, of watching the Medici outmaneuver and outshine and outrank the Pazzi at every turn, erupted in the nave of Florence Cathedral. Giuliano de Medici was stabbed 19 times. He fell near the altar. And in the frenzy of it, so consumed by violence he had lost control of the knife, Francesco de Pazzi drove his own blade through his thigh. Across the cathedral, the 2 priests went for Lorenzo. Antonio Maffei struck first, a slash to the neck. Lorenzo reacted instantly. He wrapped his cloak around his left arm, used it as a shield, drew his own sword, and backed toward the new sacristy, fighting as he moved. His companions surrounded him. One of them, the scholar Poliziano, who was present and left an eyewitness account written within days, would describe the seconds with the precision of a man who still couldn't believe what he'd seen. The bronze sacristy doors swung shut. Someone locked them from inside. Giuliano was dead on the floor of God's house. Lorenzo had survived by seconds. The conspirators had a second problem, one they hadn't taken seriously enough. Archbishop Salviati had taken a company of armed men to the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's seat of civic government, to seize it in the same moment the Medici brothers fell. He arrived. Asked to see the Gonfaloniere, Florence's chief magistrate, he was so visibly nervous that the Gonfaloniere grew suspicious before Salviati had said 3 sentences. While Salviati fumbled through his pretense, his armed men, waiting in a back room, discovered that the door's locking mechanism worked from the outside. They had locked themselves in. By accident, they were trapped. The Gonfaloniera seized Salviati. Meanwhile, the Pazzi patriarch, old Jacopo de Pazzi, rode through the streets of Florence on horseback. This was his part of the plan. If the city secretly hated the Medici, all it needed was a spark. He rode through the streets of Florence, this distinguished old man, waving his arms, crying, "Libertà! Popolo! Liberty! People of Florence!" Florence did not rise. The Florentines shouted back, "Palle! Palle!" The Medici rallying cry, a reference to the balls on their heraldic shield. Then they threw stones. The Pazzi had built their entire plan on a false premise. They believed the Medici were a regime, an imposition on the city, a power the people endured and secretly resented. They thought they were performing a liberation. What they had missed was simpler and more devastating. The Medici were not something separate from Florence. They were Florence itself. The banking, the art, the international prestige, the sheer civic identity of the city, all of it was Medici. Killing them was not freeing the city. It was attacking the city's idea of itself. By evening, it was over, and Lorenzo de Medici had come to the window of the Medici Palace on the Via Larga, shown the bandage around his neck, and let Florence see that he was alive. The crowd went quiet. Then it erupted. For him. What followed was not justice. It was something older and more deliberate. By the evening of the same day, Francesco de' Pazzi and Archbishop Salviati had been hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Not quietly, not in a prison yard before dawn. Hanged in full daylight, from the windows of the building that represented Florentine civic power, in view of the entire Piazza della Signoria. Francesco in his bloodied shirt, Salviati in his full archbishop's vestments, the golden chain of his ecclesiastical office still at his throat. Over the following weeks, more than 80 people connected to the conspiracy were executed or killed by mobs. Jacopo de' Pazzi was captured, executed, buried, then exhumed by locals and dragged through the streets. Even the dead would not be allowed dignity. But Lorenzo had something larger in mind. He ordered the legal erasure of the Pazzi family. Their heraldic devices were chiseled from every wall and building in Florence. The Pazzi name was made illegal to speak publicly, their properties confiscated. They were forbidden from marrying into Florentine families, their tombs desecrated. Portraits of the conspirators were painted on the exterior walls of the Palazzo della Signoria in a tradition called pittura infamante, defaming portraits, a form of permanent public humiliation designed to outlast the bodies. Lorenzo commissioned these portraits from the greatest artists of the age. Sandro Botticelli painted some, Filippino Lippi painted others. The men who had made Florence beautiful were now conscripted into making the Pazzi infamous. Art as weapon, beauty as punishment. Then came Baroncelli, Bernardo Bandini. Baroncelli, Giuliano's principal killer, the man who delivered the killing blow, had fled Florence immediately after the attack. He made it to Constantinople. He thought he was beyond reach. He was not. Lorenzo de' Medici wrote personally to Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the man who had conquered Constantinople 25 years earlier. He asked for the fugitive back. The Sultan complied. When Baroncelli was returned to Florence and publicly hanged in December 1479, Leonardo da Vinci was in the crowd. He opened his notebook. He picked up his pen. And with the same unhurried precision he would later bring to the mechanics of flight and the anatomy of bodies, he sketched the hanging figure. In his notebook he wrote, "A tan-colored small cap, a doublet of black serge, a black jerkin lined, a blue coat lined with fur of foxes' throats." He noted the exact colors of a dead man's clothes. Beauty and brutality, the greatest mind in Europe, a public execution, the same notebook. This is what the Renaissance was. Here is what the textbooks call the Pazzi Conspiracy. A failed coup by a rival banking family against the Medici of Florence, swiftly suppressed, the perpetrators punished. That account is technically accurate. It is almost entirely wrong. What actually happened in April 1478 was this. The Pope of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, the spiritual authority over every Catholic soul in Europe, the successor of St. Peter, approved the assassination of two men during the most sacred moment of the Mass, in a cathedral, on a Sunday morning, over a banking dispute about a town in central Italy. Sixtus IV did not hold the knife. He was careful about that. He chose his words with the precision of a man who understood what deniability was worth. I do not wish the death of anyone. But the conspirators planned in Rome. His nephew was in the room. His archbishop led the simultaneous civic takeover. His troops were positioned outside Florence. And Montesecco's deathbed confession, the written testimony of a man who had nothing left to protect, named him directly. The professional soldier understood what "I do not wish anyone's death" meant. He refused. The priests of God understood it too. They did not refuse. That is the detail the Pazzi Conspiracy cannot escape. Across 500 years, it keeps returning to this. The moral line inside a cathedral was drawn not by the church but by a mercenary. A soldier for hire found a boundary he would not cross on consecrated ground. The men who had dedicated their lives to God did not find the same boundary. And the conspiracy failed not because it was discovered or betrayed in advance. It failed because the Pazzi had a false model of what they were attacking. They believed the Medici were a regime, an imposed power that Florence endured and secretly resented. They were wrong. The Medici were the city, the banking, the art, the prosperity, the identity. You cannot liberate a city from itself. The men who tried to erase the Medici made them immortal. Lorenzo emerged from that cathedral stronger than he entered it. He survived. He rebuilt. He became, in history's telling, the Magnificent. The Pazzi name was chiseled from the stone. The Pope, the architect of all of it, made an embarrassing peace 2 years later with nothing to show for it. Diplomatically humiliated by the city he had tried to decapitate. He died in 1484. His legacy is the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the memory of what he authorized in Florence. Nobody calls him magnificent. The Pazzi stones are still there, if you know where to look. A few heraldic marks that survived Lorenzo's chisels, hidden in corners, built into walls, overlooked. The dolphin and the cross, the family that was supposed to be forgotten. But the name above the door, the family at the feast, the bank that financed the Renaissance, the men Leonardo painted and Botticelli mourned, that was the Medici. It has always been the Medici. If you want to understand the world that made this story possible, the city that could produce Botticelli and a public execution in the same afternoon, subscribe. Chronicle Zero publishes every Saturday.